minutes out, so that's when you can kind of pose, open it up to potential questions. And then I'll give you like 5 minutes.
Okay.
Actually, I'll tell you.
What year was your project for Greenland?
You guys ready?
All right, welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for one of the last sessions of Day 2 of the Pulitzer Center's 6th Annual Conference, Interconnected, Reporting the Climate Crisis. My name is Ethan Ehrenhaft, and I'm a Development and Impact Coordinator with the Center. I was Pulitzer's first employee to go through a virtual onboarding back in April 2020, so more than 2 years later, it gives me immense joy to finally meet so many of our grantees in person here this week. We're so grateful to our audience here today and to the hundreds of viewers joining us virtually this week from nearly 100 different countries. For those of you tuning in for the first time, the Pulitzer Center is a nonprofit journalism organization that supports more than 200 reporting projects every year on systemic, underreported issues around the globe and amplifies those stories through sustained outreach and education programs. This afternoon's session, Full Circle, Reporting the Climate Crisis Across the Arctic, examines climate change's disproportionate impacts on communities inhabiting the world's polar regions. Whose voices are heard when we report on the Arctic, and how do we tell compelling stories that engage readers living thousands of miles away? We are so grateful to the many individual donors and foundations who make our work possible, in particular to the major donors behind the Pulitzer Center's Arctic Reporting Fund, Andrea Bartelme, Amy Batchelor, Brad Feld, and especially Jenna Sampson, who established the Arctic Reporting Fund back in 2020. Additional thanks to the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, Walton Family Foundation, One Earth Fund, Hartfield Foundation, and other supporters of the Pulitzer Center's nationwide Connected Coastlines initiative. As a nonprofit news organization, the support of our audience and partners sustains this work. If you're inspired by what you hear here today, please consider supporting our vital mission by visiting pulitzercenter.org/donate. Thank you for being a part of this community. And finally, a few housekeeping items before we begin. Please use the hashtag Interconnected22 to join the conversation with fellow attendees and follow the conference and insights online. And a final reminder for in-person guests, we kindly request that you please keep on your masks while not eating or drinking during all conference events. So with all that said, it's my pleasure to introduce this panel's moderator, Hal Burton, a reporter at the Seattle Times. In 2019, Hal wrote about climate change in the Bering Sea and returned to the area last winter to report on the decline of snow crab fisheries with the support of the Pulitzer Center. Burton was a part of the Anchorage Daily News team that received the 1989 Pulitzer Prize for Public Service for reporting on Alaska's Native peoples, and a team at the Seattle Times that received the 2015 Pulitzer Prize for breaking news. Thank you so much for being here today, Hal, and please take it away.
Well, thanks. Thanks very much. I first wanted to say that, of course, most of this conference, much of it has been focused on rainforests and the impacts of climate change and resource extraction and all the impacts they've had on our planet. And of course, the conference theme is how things are interconnected in this climate crisis. Well, the Arctic and subarctic, they're also major areas of resource extraction that, along with minerals, include a significant percentage of the world's oil and natural gas, which, of course, as they are combusted, largely drive climate change unfolding all around the world. And the connections, when you're looking at the Arctic and oil, they don't take that much of an investigation into complex paper trails. For example, much of the crude produced on the North Slope of Alaska is refined at Washington refineries, and they provide the fuel for the vehicles that clog the freeways around Seattle, and that's a state where the transportation accounts for about 44% of the total greenhouse gas emissions. I also wanted to say that in the Arctic and subarctic, in Russia, Alaska, Norway, oil development has helped to define regional economies with huge revenue flows that have helped to provide, of course, a lot of benefits, financial benefits, and also engendered in some places, some strong and fierce support for the industry. Even as scientists have looking to the future, it's that we've got to move away from that development. The Arctic, it's also an area of increasing geopolitical tension as the fallout from Ukraine makes cooperative efforts for involving US, Canada, Russia, Norway, and other Arctic nations a lot more difficult. And it's worth recalling at this time that the US and Russia share a common maritime border that runs through the Bering and Chukchi Sea. And that's an area that includes some of the world's most important fisheries in the Bering Sea and just vital cultures of Arctic Aboriginal peoples. Just like back in 2000, I was able to fly from Nome to Providenia, Russia. That's a distance of 232 miles in a prop plane to report on a renaissance in native whaling by the Yupik people of the Chukotka region. In the years since, there's been a lot of great reporting about the impacts of climate change in the Russian North. And there's certainly a lot more to do in the years ahead as climate change unfolds. Yet, at least for the moment, it's really, really difficult, given the tensions surrounding the war, to report in Russia and network with Russian journalists, and of course, scientific collaboration, which is important for understanding what's happening, particularly in the maritime areas, also has frayed and some places just kind of gone into a deep freeze. So I have learned a lot by reading and listening to the work of our panelists here today, who I wanted to now introduce. And we are proposing to kind of have more of a conversation than perhaps how some of the other panels have unfolded. So first of all, Brett Simpson, she's a print and audio journalist. She's focused on the intersection of climate, the environment, and human rights. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, The Atlantic, National Geographic, NPR, and PRI, The World, and more places. And she ended up in Norway, which we'll talk about shortly. And then we have Alice Qannik Glenn. She's Inupiaq, born and raised in what was once Barrow and now is Yutagavik, which I mangled. She's a host and produces her own podcast show called Coffee and Quack to celebrate and explore contemporary native life in urban Alaska. And in 2021, the podcast earned an inaugural Covering Climate Now award for a special Pulitzer-supported series. And then we have Tony Bartelme. He's a senior projects reporter for the Post and Courier in Charleston, South Carolina. He's earned national honors from the Neiman, Scripps, Loeb, and National Press Foundations, and is a four-time finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. He went to Norway, so we'll learn quite a bit more about that.
Went to Greenland.
I'm sorry. I'm spacing out here. Close enough. Norway here and Greenland there. I'd like to first start with Brett, if we could. She reported focusing on a nation where the government has committed to combating climate change in a big way. They, of course, launched a funding initiative to save the rainforest that includes important support for the Pulitzer Fund, as we've learned today in the past couple of days. Norway also is a major producer of oil, and it's backing some controversial development of new mines to provide metals needed for the transition away from fossil fuels. So it's a really interesting mix. And I just want to understand, Brett, what was the focus of your reporting? What did you do when you got there, and just how did things go?
Yeah, thanks, Hal. And I just want to start out by saying I'm honored to be among journalists who have covered such different regions along this latitude that's warming twice as fast as the rest of the globe. I started out interested in what's come to be called the Arctic paradox, which is this idea that as this fast melting region becomes more vulnerable, it's also opening up for resource extraction and development projects. And then one particularly kind of contradictory Arctic region is in Norway because, as Hal mentioned, they're using the world's largest sovereign wealth fund, funded by oil, to really make a commitment to the shift to renewables. And one such renewable project that actually Norway's Minister of Industry said is necessary for the green shift for climate change was a copper mine in the Arctic that has full permission from the government to deposit its waste into an adjacent fjord, which is supporting a community of subsistence fishers and reindeer herders, an indigenous Sami community. So reporting with National Geographic, I spent nearly 3 months living alongside this community and kind of seeing how in this area that, experiencing like flash floods and then freezes and then heat waves and talking to folks whose reindeer are starving and they need to supplement their diet for the first time, or they're stuck on the docks and they can't take their fishing boats out and now threatened by this mine. And yet this mine is also positioned as the world's first zero emissions mine and is very much seen as a leading green project. And so I think that in their protests, they're really asking Norway and they're asking the planet, what are the immediate costs that we're willing to swallow for the long-term transition to renewables?
And of course, I think her reporting really points to some of the emerging issues that we're seeing in what are the conflicts as we move into trying to transition away from fossil fuels. New conflicts are emerging. And in Alaska, Alice has really given us a keen sense of place since she's took us to a place that she grew up in. She lives in Anchorage now, big urban city, where I lived for 11 years. But I think what was so cool about her reporting on her podcast was it was informed with such a keen sense of place. And I kind of want to know, because she was already doing the podcast prior to this work, what inspired you to launch into exploring the impacts of climate change?
Yeah. First, I'd like to just quickly reintroduce myself in my native language. Uvanga Qannik. Hi, everybody. Parlarif si Qannik for having me. Thank you for having me here. Uvanga Atera Qannik. My Inupiaq name is Qannik. Inupiaq Wurunga. I'm Inupiaq. Utqiagvik Miwurunga. I was born and raised in Utqiagvik, which is the northernmost city in the United States. It's about 300 miles above the Arctic Circle and some 800 miles north of where I currently live now on Dena'ina Athabascan land in Anchorage, Alaska. I now work full-time on my podcast titled Coffee and Qwaq. Qwaq is the Inupiaq word for frozen or raw meat or fish. It's particularly delicious with dipped in seal oil and a little bit of salt. So I use coffee to represent keeping us woke, quote unquote, and qwaq to represent examining our topics through an Alaska Native lens. Angayukakak Richard Saviklu, Arlene Ekelinlu Glenn, and it's customary to also share who my family is in case anybody might know who my family is, which probably not here, but my parents are Richard Savik and Arlene Ekelin Glenn. it's important to me to share my Inupiaq language because just 2 generations ago, my grandparents were put into boarding schools where they weren't allowed to speak their native language. So I tried to use any space kind of like this to bring awareness to that. So back to your question, Hal, how did I get started and why I took this focus? I went to school, so I grew up in Utqiagvik, but then I left home to go to college. I started in Arizona and finished in Florida, which is kind of funny. I'm going from Utqiagvik, Alaska, to probably one of the 2 hottest states in the U.S. It was a struggle, let's be real. But you know, in addition to like the environmental different kind of culture shock and stuff like that, I had a really hard time grappling and living in a place where people just didn't understand who I was as an Inupiaq person. I had people from like coming from California, going to school in Arizona, asking me why I eat what I eat, and kind of making these, you know, just, and I know it's just because it's out of miseducation and ignorance, but so after college I moved back home. I always felt like something was missing in my life, and so I wanted to go back home to save up money so I can get my master's degree. But once I got back home, I was so inspired by place, so inspired by reconnecting with people, reconnecting with my friends and family, language, food, obviously, and I was meeting a lot of young Indigenous doers, thinkers, and change makers around Anchorage. So I moved back to Anchorage, and Anchorage is the biggest city in Alaska, and it's kind of the hub as well, right? So if you ever want to get out of Alaska, you have to stop in Anchorage, mostly. And so it's, you know, the big city, like Hal said, and so I was reconnecting not just with Inupiaq people, but a lot of other, you know, there's at least 12 like main Alaska Native groups. And so I was meeting a lot of Indigenous people and kind of hanging out, like meeting at the store, meeting at, you know, a restaurant, at different community events. And every time I left those conversations with those, you know, people, those young people particularly, I was just very inspired. And I wish I could take what I had spoken with them about and put it in my back pocket and just whip it out every time, you know, I was in another conversation. And I thought, you know, maybe I can really do that. My favorite part of the day, you know, at work was just checking out the news and reading about, you know, what's going on within the state. But what I was beginning to realize as I moved back home was that there was a large piece of missing. Like there would be stories about my people, Inupiaq people, and it would often be just things that I didn't recognize. Like those aren't the people that I grew up knowing. Those aren't the people that I felt like I knew and was, you know, intimately I knew, because all of my favorite people, all of my heroes, my sheroes, they're all Inupiaq women, and I just wasn't seeing the place that I grew up reflected in the media that I was consuming. So I kind of thought, like, how cool would it be to have a podcast, kind of like the Joe Rogan podcast, but not Joe Rogan, obviously, and just have it be focused on Alaska Native issues, you know? And I'm a pretty curious person. I'm always interested in hearing some people's takes on things. And I grew up with my dad, my dad and my older sister, Patuk. I have 3 sisters. I'm the second oldest of 4. And my dad and my older sister, Patuk, are really great storytellers. The Inupiaq people are known to be really great storytellers. I feel like that kind of missed me. Like, I'm not a great storyteller, but it's also turned me into a great listener. And so that's been a big skill set that I've learned throughout doing my podcast. And we cover different topics. There's been some discussion about the word Eskimo and whether that's a slur or not. So I had an idea to kind of just do a podcast about Eskimo versus Inuit. And then we have LGBTQ in the Native community, which I hadn't heard a lot of people talk about. The concept of decolonization, Alaska Native men's health and wellness. And then I had a plan to do a podcast episode about climate change too. And that's when I was approached by my colleague, my friend, Jenna Kunz. She just kind of slid into my DMs and said, hey, I have this project that I'm planning out, and I was wondering if you'd like to partner with me on it. And I was like, oh, wait, like, what's going on? Like, who are you? Like, what are you planning to do? You know, I was like, you know, concerned about the language use, like, because I know that a lot of the coverage of climate change, there's also this idea of victimization and disempowering Indigenous peoples, and I felt that it was important that if we were going to do this project, we had to do it right, because it was, you know, we were going to travel to my hometown. It's not just a place on a map for me, it's my hometown, and I can't ever show my face there again if I get it wrong, you know. And so that's how I kind of met Jenna. We met on the plane to Utkalvik, which I thought was really funny, because she was just kind of blindly trusting me to take her to the northernmost city in the middle of winter. It was January, like the end of January. The sun had just come back after it sets for polar night in November. It finally comes back up in January, at the end of January. And I thought that what was important to me about this project was highlighting the adaptability and the resilience of the Inupiat instead of focusing on them as victims of circumstance, because when you victimize people, you strip them of their humanity, strip them of their power, and that can be very dangerous. And it was just so important for me to cover it in that angle, because that's my home, that's who I am, that's my people, that's what I you know, live and breathe with. So yeah, so that's a little bit how I came to be with that project. So
Well, I appreciate it. We're going to come back with more questions for everyone, but I'd like to move on to Tony, because he really has an amazing piece of journalism that I've read several times now, and each time I've delved in and learned a little bit more. But he went to Greenland, not Norway, to help report on the fate of South Carolina's coastlines. So I guess we have to ask why, what are the connections you found, what drew you there, and then how did you put this story together?
Yeah, thanks, Hal. And yeah, Greenland, you know, South Carolina, Greenland. I hope some of you got to see some of Lauren Petraka's wonderful images in the previous presentation. They're so nuanced, and I'd like you to hold them in your mind while we talk about this stuff. So it's always fun to look at how stories begin, and you could say that the Greenland connection actually began with a wisecrack. I was working on a project about 4 years ago about the Gulf Stream and how it flows off the coast of South Carolina with such force and momentum that it actually draws the sea away from the coast, kind of like a centrifuge, lowering our sea level by 3 feet. And it also, you know, flows north toward Greenland, and there is some concern that as it flows north, the melting of the green waters interrupting this great conveyor belt of ocean currents that wrap around the Atlantic, moderating our climate like a radiator. And so I was working on this complex project, and it was hot. And Charleston's really hot in the summer. And I was sitting there when my boss comes over and says, "How you doing?" And I said, "Yeah, I need to go to Greenland to cover this story right." So, you know, he knows, he's, oh, Tony's just trying to get a free vacation, and, you know, a little bit of truth in that. But then not too long after that, I came across a profile about a professor from Harvard who had done this groundbreaking research into how Greenland's ice sheet actually is so massive and so dense that it actually has its own gravitational force. It's kind of like a miniature moon. It's the size of Mexico. It's 5,000 to 10,000 feet thick, and it pulls the ocean toward it. And it actually, in South Carolina and other parts on the East Coast, are on the other end of that force, and so it pulls the ocean away from it, just kind of like the Gulf Stream pulls the ocean away. So I thought, you know what? It's exact, you know, what's happening in Greenland, if you take all the factors, thermal expansion, just the sheer melting of ice on land into the water, take them all together, what's happening in Greenland is probably the single most important thing when it comes to the future of Charleston, South Carolina. So I go back to the boss, who knew I was making a joke before, and I say, I got to go to Greenland. And so he laughed again, and I basically pitched it like a teenager asking for cars. Hey, Mitch, I got to go to Greenland. Got to do it right. And then I got a little grant from the Fund for Investigative Journalists, and so I had a little bit of money. It wasn't enough. Kept on asking for those keys, and eventually got a grant from the Pulitzer Center, and we managed to go last year in the middle of COVID. There was a tiny opening to get into Greenland. We snuck in, and we were there during the height of the summer melt. And we kind of planned that because we really basically wanted to just experience melting ice and use that as a way to somehow tell the story. And we happened to be there hiking on the ice sheet on a day that it rained. It was the same day, you may have read about it last summer, it was the same day that it rained at the top of the ice sheet, in the middle of the ice sheet, 10,000 feet high, for the first time in recorded history there. It also was raining on us when we were hiking, and it also coincidentally rained one of those torrential, increasingly frequent downpours in Charleston. So we kind of combined this experience in Greenland with the experiences of people in Charleston to really just bring home what's happening, the important things that are happening there. So that's how it all began.
Well, again, we're going to kind of keep this conversation open, going in several different directions, and then we're going to ask for questions from you all. I'd like to circle back now on something that looks at, in terms of Native peoples in the Arctic and in Alaska. I found that things can certainly get very complicated really quickly when you're trying to understand where people are coming from, what their views are, and if you are reflecting back on something that Alice says, if you put everyone in a box of victimization or this or that, they won't fit easily into those stereotypes. Just as one example, earlier this year I was reporting on some Bering Sea fisheries, and some Native groups have been vested with significant shares of the commercial seafood harvests in the Bering Sea. These are some of the biggest in North America. And so they have a real stake in those fisheries. They use the money for economic development in their communities. But at the same time, there are concerns among some tribal leaders about the impact of those fisheries on subsistence harvests. And then to make things even a little more confusing, sometimes the tribal leaders are sitting on the boards of the other groups. So trying to understand where people was coming from, I think I really needed to listen and report a little bit further. Likewise, I think when you look at oil development, oil production in Alaska, where it should happen, that the Native community of Alaska don't speak with one voice. And I was hoping that Alice could comment on that, just in terms of, are you able to report or talk about on your show, like some of the divisions about like the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, for example, which is a famous point of contention on where things should head in the Arctic?
Yeah, you're going to get me in trouble, Hal. Yeah, there's a real unique, maybe not unique, but just interesting relationship that the Inupiat people have to oil development, obviously, because Prudhoe Bay is the, I think biggest domestic oil field in America. Maybe, I don't know, if not the, then one of the top. And some of my podcast episodes, that's just something we couldn't overlook. We had to speak about it a little bit. And one of the biggest takeaways I take from one of my interviews was with Ives Brouwer, and we spoke about water and sewer infrastructure in Utrecht specifically. And what I learned from that podcast episode and interviewing with him was that the water and sewer infrastructure in Utrecht is the second most expensive utility per person ever made. It's second to, can anyone take a guess to what it might be second to?
Saudi Arabia?
It's the, what is that? No, it's the International Space Station.
Oh, jeez.
Yeah. Yeah. It cost several $1 million to install it because of the permafrost in Utrecht. And so who do you think is going to pay for that? You know, who do you think would be willing to pay millions and millions, like I'm talking hundreds of millions of dollars, to install something that takes a community out of third world conditions and bring them up to the 21st century? You know, I think that it's easy to think black and white about these issues of oil development, but you know, just years prior to Prudhoe Bay opening, we were still heating our homes with driftwood, and you know, we don't have trees in northern Alaska, so you can imagine driftwood and seal oil lamps. And also, you know, we used to have to haul water out on sled dogs to go get ice to melt for water. So I think that it's easy for many to judge like what's the right thing to do. Obviously, at a global level, there's issues, but who are we to tell people in the Arctic, if you don't live and breathe and die in the Arctic, who are you to tell someone how to live there in such harsh conditions? As we were there in Utrecht, my dad was a subsistence whaling co-captain, and while we were there in January, and what was it? It was just before the pandemic hit in 2020. Our whaling captain passed away, and so we had a funeral. It was good that I was there. I got to be with him before he passed, but also I was there to help dig the grave. Have you ever dug a grave in, 12 feet of permafrost? I mean, it's not easy. So, and then you use power tools for those kinds of things. What powers those tools, you know? And so it's easy to feel one way or another, but I just felt so kind of just angry at people who kind of oversimplify the idea of like us versus them or whatever. It's not that simple. And so this idea with opening up ANWR, I don't want to comment too much on it. I just want to encourage everyone to be inclusive and listen to different voices, because you know there are different experiences, and you'll learn from each Native person to Native person. There's a different opinion on all of that. I think that that's good. Discourse is good. It's good to get these things out in the open, because the more that we collectively know, then we're more better informed to make decisions locally about what to do. And so I think that the North Slope Borough was incorporated shortly after oil was discovered in Prudhoe Bay, and because of that, we have taxes, property taxes on oil and gas infrastructure, and because of that, we're able to heat our homes, go to school, have like public safety. It's a difficult topic for me, because like if we didn't have that, I don't know if I'd be here today. That funded my education. I wouldn't be where I am without that. I have conflicted thoughts about it, and especially after a conference like this, but I just feel like it's important to ask questions and to be more informed and not just make generalizations about those kinds of things. So that's as far as I want to go with that, Hal. Thank you.
Brett, I wanted to talk with you about that same topic, because from reading your article in Norway, I found that when you did a lot of reporting with the Native community there, the Aboriginal community, and I think you found some differences of opinion on the mine that you talked about. And I wondered if you could discuss that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like Alice was saying, Indigenous voices are not a monolith, and there are a few things that are interesting about Sami history. They didn't gain formal recognition from the Norwegian government until 1980, after a starvation protest over a hydroelectric dam. And since reindeer herders in particular have gained rights, but then also their territory has been fragmented, and they've been displaced because of windmills, power lines, hydroelectric dams, and extraction projects. And so it's really, they've seen a history of renewable development that they've fought back against. At the same time, they're only about 10% of Sami are reindeer herders, and there was really aggressive Norwegianization campaigns throughout the 20th century up until the 80s. And so in this area that I was reporting in, this town that this mine was proposed, the town leaders approved the mine, and the mayor is Sami, and about 87% of people who live there have Sami heritage, but some don't claim it, and others, they're looking more at this town, which used to be a fishing area for them. That now the kind of small boats have been replaced by commercial fleets that sell directly to China. So there's a little grocery store right on the water, and the Norwegian salmon that you buy there has been to China and back. And so they're like looking for economic prospects. They're looking for the young people to stay because everybody's going south to Oslo. It's really a population that is already small and is just declining. And they see this mine as bringing jobs. So I think that there are, I spoke just so many interesting things. Like one man that I spoke to said that his family was Sami, but not anymore. They're Norwegian now. And his daughter she rides a little reindeer from the Frozen movie. Like she has a little toy reindeer. And Frozen was a movie produced, actually like the first movie produced. Disney had an agreement with the Sami parliament to they approached an indigenous culture and said, could we, we understand that we are appropriating here, we'll consult you and bring you into this project. And so just even seeing these kind of contradictions with culture and identity happening on the ground here, and then also it was really, really complicated.
Was there any sense of, did most of the Sami support the mine, or most probably opposed, or it really depended if you were in the traditional fishing group versus the reindeer? And
I mean, I think it completely depended, and I think that the town was split about 50-50. I don't think that you could really say it was it was like parents against kids, and there was a large protest, but and the strongest opposition were fishers, but even a fisherman who says I'm raised as a sea Sami, and I'm a subsistence fisher. His son is I'm not Sami. No, those are the reindeer people, and so it's just kind of you can see those tensions playing out.
I think in Bristol Bay, Alaska, where a massive mine was proposed and looked like it might go through during the Trump administration, there's also an incredibly vibrant commercial fishery in which a lot of the community participates in. And there, I think, among the native groups as well as other folks, there was strong opposition in that region to the mine, even as other parts of Alaska thought, hey, let's go develop this. And of course, in a recent action by the Biden administration, it looks like the mine has a major roadblocks that would stop it from being developed by a designation that was recently proposed by the Biden administration. But anyhow, I do want to circle back a little more to Greenland, where, Tony, I know you were on the ice with a shaman, and I think that worked into your story. I know that it wasn't as much the focus for you, but it'd be interesting if you could describe the Aboriginal community there, and then also give us a sense of, maybe a little better sense of the whole issue of gravity that you described so well, that I knew nothing about. You know, you think of ice melting and it all melts and the ocean rises just on a sort of like a swimming pool, and we're one big swimming pool, it all rises together, and he just ripped that whole scenario apart in his story, and you almost reimagine like the forces on Earth. It's really interesting.
Yeah, thanks. So gravity, yeah. I think, it's on a deep level. We have all these little neural networks swirling around in our head, and it's our job to kind of herd those neural cats, because what are stories if not symbols on a page, pixels on a screen, arranged in a certain order that creates meaning inside of our heads. And when I'm doing my job right, I have arranged those neural feelings, neural networks in a mind that manifests itself in someone saying, "Oh, I didn't know that," because that's the opening that you try to create, and that's really the impact. When you talk about impact of a story, that's what I hope for. So this gravitational effect one, it was kind of stunning to me, and it began just simply with reading, a scientific paper and a profile, and then I talked to the guy and talked to a bunch of researchers and realized that there had been this massive body of research. This was not, a debate. This was physics. This is something you could really put your stamp on as a journalist, and so that sort of is very helpful in a place where like South Carolina, which is read as a stop sign, and is there's a lot of skepticism. So that gravitational aspect was really important. It's really complicated in a lot of ways to describe, but it's also can be very simple too if you use a lot of metaphors, and that's what I try to do. And as far as the Inuit, so when you're trying to tell a complicated stories, you're looking for guides, and what could be a better guide than a shaman who is intimately familiar with the ice sheet in Greenland and has been on there for 3,000 times, and it's just this deep soul. You could tell just talking to him. And so that's what I'm looking for in a story, is looking for characters who will help drive the narrative, trying to propel the reader, connect with the reader in such a way that you can convey very complicated information and create maybe a little bit of that little internal shift in your mind.
So one last question, then we're going to open up to everyone for questions, but like the impact, okay, you've told everyone in South Carolina that the Greenland ice melting is going to have particular impact, is having particular impact in South Carolina, and it's probably going to get worse. Not just because it's getting warmer, but because this gravitational effect is working against South Carolina. When you read the comments, or when you got your emails, and I mean, what were people, was it all over the map, or did you ever get the sense that there were some people who weren't really thinking that way at all, who say, hey, I get it? What was the...
So most people said, oh, I didn't know that. So, yeah. And then, then there are a lot of people, well, it's actually a minority of people who will say, it's all about sunspots or something, it has nothing to do with climate change, and you're just bought and sold by whatever. But that's a minority.
I would have thought it would be almost 50-50.
It's
so
not.
That's interesting.
It's surprisingly positive, and I think that speaks to a lot of kind of the collective body of work that we've all done.
Well, I'm we have about 30 minutes here, and I first want to know, like, if folks have questions in any direction. I know we've gone a little bit in different directions in this conference panel. Please, and come to a microphone because we are recording this, and we have people online who want to hear your questions as well.
Hello?
Yeah.
Sorry. Hi, my name is Claes Lundström. I'm a reporter based and born in Sweden, which is also an Arctic country. I've been doing a lot of reporting from the Arctic part of Sweden, especially in terms of indigenous people and the military expansion of NATO exercises and stuff, which that has nothing to do with my question. My question is, what surprised you the most in terms of your reporting, both for the good and the bad, if that makes sense?
Who's this directed to?
I would like to hear from all three.
Okay. Why don't we go with Brett first?
Sure. I don't know if this is surprising so much as the image that stuck with me the most. I had the opportunity to, when the 2021 IPCC report came out, I drove 5 hours to Tromsø and kind of reported a quick story for The World, a radio program. And because I'm a journalist, I just contacted one of the lead authors, and I got full permission to go into this freezer vault underground in the Norwegian Polar Institute, where they keep ice cores from sea ice. And one of the big headlines in 2021 is that sea ice is disappearing. And so this scientist took me into this like very, very, very cold vault that had these styrofoam, basically coffins that were 3 meters long, because the drill is 3 meters long. And for decades, he's been going and pulling these ice cores from off the coast of Svalbard. And only in the past few years, as he opened the box and showed me, are the cores getting shorter than the drill. And so he opened kind of one box after the other from different locations with the passing years, and I just saw, and I got to hold in my hands cores that were smaller and smaller and smaller, and just like doing that with the knowledge that in my lifetime, there wouldn't be cores to collect anymore, I think changed a lot for me as a climate journalist and just as a person.
That's interesting. Two things that I thought were the most interesting throughout my time with this project. One, we were just discussing before you guys came in, but the idea of language loss as an impact of climate change. In Inupiaq, we call something pekaluyak, and that means in the Arctic Ocean, by a process of freezing, melting, and refreezing, you can get fresh water on top of sea ice to drink when you're out whaling or fishing or hunting, right? And it's a term that a lot of people don't use very much anymore because we're seeing less and less of multi-year sea ice. That doesn't happen with, over one winter. It happens over several winters and over a long period of time, and we're losing some words that are associated with rapid changes in climate. That's one. Second is my younger sister, Roberta Glenn. Or Roberta Barade, she's married now. She just got her master's, and she did a lot of field work. Her master's in geography with a focus on coastal erosion and water table indices, things associated with climate change. And she was going in and out of different villages in Alaska. And being an Inupiaq woman, it was important for her to engage with the local community, the local Native community, and what she had learned, because I was consulting her throughout my project, just to, pick her brain a little bit. And she told me, which I'm not really surprised by it, but I think it was just very interesting, is that a lot of the town sites where these people have settled, they used to kind of just be transient places. We were seasonal nomadic as Inupiaq people and Yupik people. And so they weren't meant to be permanent places. They're places to camp and come and go, and you know, throughout seasonal hunting practices, you move from place to place and follow the animals, right? And so many of these places where they're settled, it was due to the rapid westernization and colonization of Alaska that we were forced to stay there for schools, to go to the church and all that kind of stuff. And so the reason that some of these places are being threatened by climate change is because they were never meant to be permanent places to begin with. So some of these villages built on a sandbar, Inupiaq people and Yupik people knew that this is not it's not a good place to build a village, a city. And so I think that has been a story largely untold, and I thought that was really interesting to learn from my sisters. So those are my two.
So yeah, what surprised me about Greenland, so when I'll never forget landing in the plane and then going down this road toward a town and seeing the icebergs off in the distance. It was just a heart-stopping type of moment because of the scale. It's just so vast and so huge and so beautiful. And I don't know if any of you have ever been to the Grand Canyon, you know, look at the Grand Canyon. It's one of those sort of heart-stopping moments. But imagine instead of the reds and the blue, the reds and the browns, it's white and blue. And then multiply that by 1,000, and we don't see it. Nobody ever gets to see it. You know, very few people get to see it. And it's just so hard to take in and absorb. And so, all right, so you're saying, oh, yeah, great, Tony and Lauren got to see really beautiful stuff. True. But it's incredibly important, I think, to incorporate beauty in your stories, wonder. And it's especially important where I live in South Carolina, because if you don't have that sort of counter, people will tune out. There's a lot of hope. There's a lot of hopelessness and doom in climate change stories. And if you can find the wonder in your story, you're gonna capture people too, just like those.
I'm going to
icebergs.
mention one more thing, which I sort of took out of Brett's story, and maybe she could just describe this person a little bit more. But the CEO of the copper company, you know, like talk about somebody who didn't quite fit into your stereotype. I don't know, maybe there is no stereotype of someone who's going to develop a copper mine, but could you just, when I read your story, that was like the point where I go, whoa.
Yeah, I met for a 3-hour interview with the CEO of this copper mine, who is a self-proclaimed climate nut. He's an obsessive recycler. He is the kind of person who, when he has like a metal container, he separates all the different metals so that they go to the magnet faster, you know, so that, you know, one magnet can get all the different metals. And he doesn't own a car, and his daughter is the head of climate for their town. And he, I think that he rationalizes, thinks about this mine like in a really specific, interesting way, which is, you know, one, it's going to be the world's first zero emissions mine, and two, which I think is really, really compelling, Norwegians are big consumers of you know, laptops and phones and, you know, all of these things that use copper. And he was like we should, maybe we shouldn't, but I think that we should be able to see in our own backyards the effect of where this all comes from, and try to do it responsibly, and, you know, try to lead the way in this shift. At the same time, you know, he got involved in this project about 25 years ago, and there was no talk of zero emission mines then. But I think that, you know, he's at least moving with the rest of Norway, and kind of, you know, is seeing this mine as, yeah, definitely a part of that plan and an opportunity to get copper in a more responsible way. I mean, I think that the counter argument to that is, you know, you could also be investing in copper recycling or, you know, something like that. But yeah, it was really interesting.
Next question.
Sure. So I am wondering about what Indigenous like a spirituality and connection to the land looks like in the Arctic space, because I think a lot of the time in my reporting in Puerto Rico, I did a project about the Taino people and their connection with their land. You see a lot of times in the Amazon, reporters will focus on that connection that the many indigenous peoples of the Amazon have with their land, and that's something that happens all over the world. So I'm wondering what that looks like in the Arctic space, and what indigenous leaders and communities are kind of saying about their ice melting and all the things that are happening on a, I guess, spiritual and cultural level.
As for me, and I know this kind of across the board, even including Native Americans, but you know, land influences identity. You know, I was just speaking with Brett yesterday, thinking like, how weird would it be to not be from where I'm from? Like, I draw so much identity from my ancestors being from a certain place in the world on the map. You know, there's this word that we use for the environment, and it's nunam irusearun, and it just means the ground and everything around it. And there's the way that you say it, it's in an Inupiaq language, it's a little bit more than just, you know, what it feels like in English. You know, I don't know how to explain that. But yeah, there's a podcast episode I did with Jack and Brar, France, and they're whaling brothers, whaling and hunting brothers. And they have such a profound respect and intimate relationship with, you know, where they live, the ocean, up inland when they travel. It's funny because when I went home for a big celebration called Kiviak, where we invite a bunch of neighboring villages to come share stories, dance, sing, share food, you see them dancing, right? And there's a drum dance that we have, and I can't understand 100% my language yet, but I'm relearning. And so all of the songs are done in Inupiaq, but I can't ever fully understand what they're saying in my native language. But when they, you know, the way that they're dancing and their arms and their movements, they tell stories that way. And we went straight from the celebration Kiviak, and we took four-wheelers to go to the northernmost tip, you know, we call it the point, or Nuvuk. And we were like, oh yeah, do you see that over there? And then you're kind of like doing these motions, and you're like, yeah, over there somewhere. And it's kind of like you're dancing. The way that you act out on the land is the way that Inupiaq dancing is. And so I was like, oh yeah, all the dances make sense when you just go out on the land and go hang out with your mom and your sisters for a bit. But yes, there's a profound intimacy that Inupiaq people have with the land, and they always have. And one of the villages on the North Slope, so where I'm from, it's a land mass of about 95,000 square miles. That's about as big as Wyoming or Oregon. And that connection to the land is so important for everyone. And there's one village named Tikiak, it's called Point Hope in English. It's the longest continuously inhabited village in America. I think there's one other one in New Mexico that might be around the same time, but that's Tikiak's claim to fame, and they'll let you know. And you know, to know that your ancestors have been on these trails, you know, and you can't see them physically, right? And there's not a lot of there's not like what you would say signs of civilization or whatever, because it's clean, you take care of the land, and it's just, it's hard to put into words, but there is a deep, profound respect and intimate relationship that all Inupiaq people have to place. You don't ever feel alone. You know, some people might think that, you know, oh, you're in the cold Arctic and it's just like a wasteland up there or whatever, but it's really not when your people have lived there for thousands of years. So I can't stress it enough. And even though I don't live there anymore, I'm still in awe by my hometown all the time. And I always listen to stories. You know, there's just so much that it encompasses. It's a full identity, stories, folklore, language, it all connects. And
I'd also like to jump in with one sort of memory I have of the story I reported in Chukotka that the Yupik Eskimos, well, we say Yupik, we won't say Eskimo, the Yupik people, who also are they're both on both sides of the Bering Strait under Soviet rule. You know, the whale hunt, which was to their culture very much a spiritual and traditional underpinning of their lives, turned into an industrialized whaling ships coming up, killing all these gray whales, and then feeding them to fox farms. And the jobs of the Yupik people were to tend these fox farms. And I visited these fox farms before right after the fall of the Soviet Union, as everything was opening up and you could start to travel over there. And then I was able to go back in 2000 when, with the help of the Inupiaq people, they were reclaiming their traditional whale hunts. They had provided harpoons from Alaska and also some other equipment. And we went out on a whale hunt where it was partly for meat, but also to sort of reassert their old traditional culture. And that was really, really important to sort of picking things up after the fall of the Soviet Union, even as sort of the old infrastructures were imploding around them, and it was pretty unforgettable. Luckily, they did kill the whale and bring it to shore, and there was meat, and there was really a reconnection. And I did want to say now, like, I'm having those memories, and I had quite a few amazing adventures in the Russian Far East in that period, and it is painful to me now to think about how cut off we are right now. And for anyone who has interest, I think one thing to monitor is whether we're able to resume reporting, what kind of reporting is going to be able to be having, because the biggest part of the Arctic is there. And what kind of connections can we have with Russian journalists? I mean, we've been talking about networking. Man, there's a lot of Russian journalists. What fears do they have now about partnering with us? What repercussions? It's just a whole bunch of stuff to sort out, and I don't have the answers right now. I wish I did.
Yeah, Hal, that's a good point, and also to note that the Arctic Council is suspended until further notice, which is, usually are meeting regularly to discuss, so many different things, security, fisheries, and all kinds of projects. So that is just not something that's happening. But to go back very quickly to the question, because this is something that Alice and I talked about, and I did want to kind of talk about how it relates to this sense as a non-Indigenous person, reporting on Indigenous communities and coming in, and the risks of parachute journalism and extractive journalism, and coming in with preconceptions or romanticization. And I think that it's very important to note that it's not romanticizing a culture to remark upon the fact that it's continuous in a single place for 10,000 plus years. Because like you said, you can't imagine not being from the place that you're from. I can, I'm not, and like I'm not living where my ancestors were. And so even down on a language level, as we were talking about, the memory in language is just so important to preserve, and it's memory of climate change as well. We were talking earlier because I also recently reported a story in Alaska that the Tlingit word for Glacier Bay is actually bay replacing glacier. And so it is a place name that contains a memory of climate change. And I think that these kinds of things, if we can hold on to these words, it's actually, that's a record that is
That's
just crucial.
It's like a story in itself,
Yeah, it's a process. It's a description of a process. It's not just Glacier Bay. Yeah.
Do we have another question over here? I'm sorry.
Hi, thank you all so much for being here. I'm really kind of taken aback by what you have to say. So I'm a college student in Michigan, and I am lucky enough to go to a school that has a land agreement with our local tribe. And so I've been kind of working for the majority of the time that I've been there to build a connection with the tribe, which I understand is takes a long time to do, to build that trust and everything. So I'm kind of wondering from you guys, when you go to different places that you haven't been, how do you form relationships with those people there and show them that they can trust you, especially as a white person coming from I don't know, something that's not familiar with their culture at all? Kind of how do you best represent that? And then also how do you show them, I've had a lot of kind of worry that the story I tell about one person or family will represent the whole community, and they don't want that to happen, of course. So how do you work with people who have those fears and then kind of tell the stories to the best of your abilities?
So I'll briefly ask you this question. When you go to a new place, what happens in your mind? Does it ping pong back to, let's say you see something new, it ping pongs back to something you've already experienced, and I think that's what happens when we go to new places and meet new people. We experience them, and then we try to absorb, compare, contrast, and that's, I think, can be a problem. So you have to be really mindful of that sort of that ping pong, and if you're able to honestly say, okay, I've got these past experiences, they may affect my idea of who this person is, and just be honest that, hey, I don't know what's really happening. I could not answer any of these questions about Indigenous people in Greenland. I was only there a couple weeks. If you're just honest and show people that, and show people your vulnerability, that helps you establish rapport, that you're a human being just like them. There are universal things between all of us. And if you do that, you'll establish rapport and you'll be okay.
I'd like to just say really quick too. So I did a project not in my hometown. I did it in Nome, which is another Inupiaq community, but it was my first time in Nome. And it was a project about systemic issues around sexual violence against Indigenous women in Nome. It was a really hard story, to tell and to do the interviews. And we had worked together, my colleague Jenna, who I worked with this climate change project with, she was also my partner for this project too, one of my partners. And so we did a lot of the work. It was hard, and you just kind of want to cry when you hear these stories all the time. So we were just kind of tired. We're like, oh, let's just get it done. Let's just get it done. We ended up writing it and then shared it with the person, one of the people that we interviewed, one of the survivors. And she read it and she was just pissed off. She was like, why are you talking about, I'm not defined by the worst moment in my life. Humanize me like this. I'm not happy with this. You're making me, you're victim blaming me, and at that time I just completely broke down. It's a difficult topic to cover, and especially as an Inupiaq woman, but in Inupiaq culture, we have this thing called sok. And I feel like it's the Inupiaq love language, it's where if you're not getting called out or scolded or, if people aren't paying attention to you, then they don't love you. And if they don't take time to scold you and try to help you to be better and to do it right and to really take your time and be pensive and really think about the responsibility and the stories that you share, then they just don't care about you, and that's worse, right? And so I kind of had to take it with a grain of salt. I broke down that night. I started crying. I called everyone, but it ultimately made our project better. So don't get discouraged. Even as an Inupiaq person covering other Inupiaq people, I can make that mistake as well too. But you just have to be really open and willing to learn there's this Melissa Shaginoff. She said this. Consenting to learn in public. That's what basically you're being as a journalist. And so I would just encourage you to don't give up, keep going. You're gonna run into bumps in the road and you might get it wrong, but it's ultimately gonna make you a better person and make your work better.
I would just sort of wrap things up to say that, none of this is easy, but it sure is interesting. I think for a lot of us, this has been, I don't know, I feel very fortunate to have had these opportunities to report and to learn, and it's great to hear Alice and to just some of the insights you've shared have really, I don't know, they're great. So, and everybody else, Tony and Brett, all the time that you guys have spent reporting and bringing back your stories and connecting with people, I think it's really been an amazing thing. And again, that I think for all of us, the Pulitzer Center has helped us think a little bit bigger about what we can do. So that's a good thing. And now I understand that this is the last session. We're down to the last minutes, and there's like a reception, right? So I don't want to keep people from it, but I really appreciate everyone hanging in here and being part of this and sharing.
Thank you.
Yeah.